right, and we are back for yet another edition of the Starting 502 podcast. As always, Presley, Meyer, your host for the most. And today we are joined by a very special, I'm hesitant to call him a guest, a host of the From the Pink Seats podcast, but we'll call him a friend of the show, Matt McGavic from Louisville Report.
Regular contributor, I guess is the way to put it.
Very regular contributor, Matt McGavic. Matt, how are we doing today, man?
Doing good. It's nice to kind of deviate from my standard lane of football and baseball. Not to say I don't dabble into basketball, because clearly I do, but my two sports, at least growing up, were football and baseball. And I think even now, those are the two sports that I have the most like intimate knowledge into how to break it down. But, you know, I'm down to talk to some basketball from time to time.
If you're covering Louisville sports, it's the thing that people are the hungriest about. Before we get started, do you know what today is by chance?
Hump Day?
It is Hump Day, but it's also National Bourbon Day. So, you know, it could be in the weeks and months, you know, leading up to the season. But if you're listening, it's National Bourbon Day when we're recording this. So make sure that you pour yourself a nice hefty pour of bourbon before you dive into this podcast. Now, Matt, quick question for you. What was you may not have seen either, I don't know, better remake, Space Jam 2 or White Men Can't Jump 2?
I actually have not seen the remake of White Man Can't Jump. I did see Space Jam 2, and it wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. I mean, it just wasn't super memorable. Like, I remember Space Jam 1 being. Now, granted, that's something that I saw as a kid, and I always remember watching that the first time.
Right.
I'll still watch it every once in a while. But I never got that vibe from Space Jam 2. Now, granted, I don't think it was completely terrible. It just wasn't noteworthy, I guess is the way to put it.
It wasn't Space Jam, you know. Like
no.
Yeah, and that's what
this is what it felt like to me. It felt like an opportunity for Warner Brothers just to display every single IP that they have.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it felt like to me.
Yep. I think that's a great takeaway from it. I mean, White Men Can't Jump is kind of in the same vein. It seems like they tried to recreate and modernize versions of scenes that happened in the previous movie. And it's pretty much almost just like a take for take storyline. So interesting how, you know, we're kind of running out of narratives and trying to reestablish narratives, if you will, in movies. But getting to actual basketball on the court, tell me if I'm sick in the head or not. Okay. I am as excited. I mean, yes, that goes without saying, but does it change your opinion of just how sick I am that I'm just as excited in this offseason for Louisville basketball as I was under Rick Pitino or Chris Mack or going back to Denny Crum? Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it me that's sick in the head, or is it us as fans, trying to make something positive happen?
I mean, I'm not going to say you're sick in the head, because I would say you were sick in the head if there wasn't a reason to be even remotely excited. But I mean, there is a reason to be somewhat optimistic, or at least excited at the very minimum, just because of the amount of talent that Kenny Payne and the rest of his staff was able to bring in. I mean, it's not like this is the same roster that Louisville had last season, which, by the way, I refuse to go along with the narrative that Louisville lacked talent last season. Granted, the talent level is not what we come to expect here with the University of Louisville, but to say that they were completely devoid of talent is just, it's a fabrication. It's an outright lie. I mean, it seemed like one of those situations where the talent and the chemistry just wasn't there.
Yeah, I would say a better way to put it was that the talent was there, but the pieces assembled were an incomplete roster by a lot. I would say that, you know, the lack of legitimate guard depth on that team was a huge concern, and the lack of camaraderie and overall confidence from the team was just, I mean, we'd never seen anything like it.
Legitimately, if L. Ellis was not the only ball handler, that team, I mean, probably doesn't do a whole lot in the grand scheme of things, but they certainly don't go 4-28. That's for sure.
Listen, I may be sick, but, you know, I just want to continue to see improvements and kind of dive into what this roster looks like, because, I mean, you essentially have 9 players that weren't on the roster last year that are this year. And so right there already, that gives you a great excuse just to dive in and be a basketball nerd for the next 150, 175 days as we're approaching the season. I actually had a dream last night that Louisville played.
You are sick.
That Louisville played, and I'm just remembering this just now. I had a dream last night that Louisville played its first exhibition game and lost like 300 to 112 or something like that. Like,
oh God.
Yeah. You know how dreams are, but it was just like one of those, like, oh, Louisville's making a comeback. And then, people were, getting on me on Twitter about, oh, you're always trying to just spin the narrative.
It's like Chris Paul makes a huge three to cut the deficit to 42.
Yes, exactly.
Is that
a dagger from Chris Paul to cut it to 42. That's exactly what's happening for Louisville against like Chaminade or something like that in an exhibition in my dreams. But in reality, in real life, we are looking at a roster that's completely reconstructed. In your opinion, how would you grade out how the staff has kind of reconstructed this roster in the offseason?
I mean, it's hard to give them anything short of an A, maybe an A- at the least, because there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They had to flip the roster almost completely on its head. Maybe retain a couple pieces here and there from the 2022-23 roster, but given how bad they performed, and make no mistake, it was bad, they had to just completely clean house. And not only did they clean house, by and large, they did it by bringing in players who are what we kind of expected Kenny Payne to bring in. Now, a lot of people were quick to dog Kenny for his recruiting, swings and misses in the past offseason, which, I mean, there were a handful of them. I'm not going to say that there weren't some layups that they missed on, but I mean, given like the climate at that point, I mean, this was a first-year head coach rejoining a college basketball recruiting atmosphere that was wildly different than it was from me. Remember just the 2 seasons prior, and the NCAA thing cloud was still a thing, so everything was kind of working against him, at least in that first off season. So this was our first real chance to see, okay, what can Kenny Payne do? What can this staff do as it pertains purely from a recruiting standpoint? The coaching aspect is the jury's still out on that part, but the recruiting aspect, in their very first opportunity, and I wrote a column about this about a month or so ago, saying that like in their first opportunity to showcase their recruiting chops, they passed with flying colors. I mean, could they have gotten a DJ Wagner? Could they have gotten an Aaron Bradshaw? Could they have gotten a Keon Minifield? Or sure, if you want to play semantics, we can play that card. But I mean, they were able to bring in a high school class that's top 5. They were able to bring in 3 solid transfers, 2 of them which should be regular contributors in year 2 under Payne. And it's when you put it all together, at least on paper, you have probably one of the most talented Louisville teams that we have seen in the last decade and a half. So as far as this offseason goes and the staff's ability to bring in players, I mean, at the very minimum, you give them an A-.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, this is probably the most talented roster that of our adult lives, Matt. Now, I know there were some teams in the 70s and 80s that, people would talk about, well, if there's a recruiting class,
right,
rankings, if that existed back then the narrative would be a little bit different. But since 2000, 2001, when these rankings really, when this became a thing, when we started ranking recruits and really paying attention online to recruiting, since then, this is, I mean, I can't think of a class that was more talented on paper than this class.
I looked into it. I can't remember the exact classes, but the last time I checked, this was the number 5 high school class. And I believe it was 04 and 11. I could be completely wrong, but I know there were 2 classes in front of this one that both ranked number 3 overall.
Yeah, when you look at the class that had Wayne Blackshear and Shane Bohannon, that was a really solid incoming class. I think that's the last time we had this type of hype around the class. Now, obviously, Chris Mack's Super Six class that came in, had some pretty significant hype. Don't get me wrong. But I think that Chris Mack was more seen as an X's and O's guy that could take those players and mold it into a number one seed type of team under his tutelage. It just so happened that most of those guys, for the most part, those guys just did not pan out. I think JJ Traynor is the only guy that's left from the Chris Mack era. Most of those guys went elsewhere, and probably with good reason. And I understand people's doubts that they have with players coming in because of the lack of success that Louisville's had with big name players, probably over the last decade to 2 decades, right? With that in mind, though, I think that the way this roster was constructed had Kenny Payne's kind of style of play in mind. I think a lot of these guys are guys that are going to fit well together. And so that kind of leads me into my next question for you, which is, this roster is very young, probably going to end up being one of the 25 youngest rosters in the country. People are really down on this coaching staff's ability to develop guys and to put on the
competitive
floor.
Product.
Yeah. A competitive product out on the floor. So people have never doubted Kenny Payne's recruiting chops.
Actually, going back to your point about this being one of the top 25 youngest teams in college basketball, try top 10, because I had Bart Torvik pulled up because I know that's what we're going to talk about later in the show.
Right.
And sorted by projected experience, Louisville is the 8th youngest team in college basketball, or is projected to be.
I believe that. And I mean, when you look across the roster, JJ Traynor is the only senior. You got 2 juniors in Brandon Huntley Hatfield and Karan Davis, but Karan Davis never played at this level of basketball. And Brandon Huntley Hatfield has spent his first 2 seasons battling injuries, not significant playing time on the court outside of a few, pretty solid stretches for him. So it'll be interesting to see how guys kind of play off of each other. But that kind of leads me into who becomes the leader on this team. It seems obvious that it would be Huntley Hatfield and Traynor. But in your opinion, who steps up and takes those leadership roles?
I think the easy answer is probably JJ Traynor, just because he's been around the longest. He's the local guy. He knows what it means to play for Louisville, yada, yada, yada. But if I had to take a guess who's going to be the quote unquote leader, I think it's going to be Mike James, because we spent an entire year thinking, okay, what could this team have been if Mike James was healthy? And then the first chance we get to see him, he does phenomenal. And he ends up being the second leading scorer on the team, second only to L. Ellis. Now, saying all that, I mean, Mike James was not without his flaws. I mean, his defense needs to improve, his rebounding needs to improve. But from a pure scoring perspective, I mean, he did really well. Now, he just needs to kind of shore up on those other aforementioned aspects. But if he can do that as someone who is one of the oldest on the team, I believe that Mike James can potentially step up and be that leader. And a wild card to me for the quote unquote leader is probably Sky Clark. I know he's a newcomer transferring in after 1 year at Illinois, but if you follow him on social media at all, he is extremely active on just getting involved with his teammates, hyping his team up, and taking shots at Kentucky fans any chance that he gets. So, I mean, that's going to endear a lot of Louisville fans out there. But I would say Mike James, maybe Sky Clark would step up and be the leaders of the scene. And Sky Clark, it also helps with he's the point guard too, or is going to be the starting point guard.
I think it's going to be Dennis Evans. I'm just kidding with you. No, if I'm looking at leaders on the team outside of JJ and Brandon Huntley Hatfield, to me, it immediately goes to Sky Clark and to Trenton Flowers. I think that Trenton Flowers is a guy with a great head on his shoulders. He's going to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, he's got to be the youngest guy on this team because he's a reclass from the class of 2024. So he's probably just turning 18 right now. If I had to guess, I remember listening to one of his interviews, I believe he was 17, just turning 18. But with that in mind, though, I mean, this is a guy with a great head on his shoulders. This is a guy that was a finalist to make it to the USA under-19 team, which consists of a lot of guys who are freshmen and sophomores in college. And this is a guy that's, coming into his, the summer before his freshman year of college. and is already, considered one of the 12 or 15 best guys that are trying to make the final roster for the USA under 19 team. So that's nothing to sneeze at all. And this is a guy that's the son of a coach as well. So it'll be kind of fascinating to watch the dynamic of this team. I use that word a lot, fascinating, this season, because it's really unprecedented the way that this roster has been assembled. We're used to it in football with the roster turnover, because you got to learn 25, 30, 40 new guys each year. But we're not used to this in basketball. We're used to 2 or 3 guys trying to assimilate with an already constructed roster. So when you have 9 new players coming in, all of whom could probably have a significant contribution on this team, it really is interesting to just watch how the roster is assimilating and watch how wrong that we're going to end up being, right? Like we're all talking about, well, this freshman's going to do this and this guy's going to do that. But the reality is that there's a guy out there, whether it's Karan Davis or Curtis Williams, or maybe a Dennis Evans, these guys that were like, oh, well, they might come along as the season progresses. There could be a guy that just comes out of nowhere that ultimately ends up beating guys out in practice. So that's the stuff that really just, I like to hit on in the offseason, because it'll be really interesting to see come October and November what the actual roster looks like. So I think sounds like you're going, leaning a little bit older as far as leadership. To me, I think that last year that was something that Louisville seriously lacked. So I think that there's a place on this team for a guy to come in as a freshman or a sophomore. Maybe it's like a Trey White that comes in and just is a significant contributor and, a real, I hate this term, but a locker room guy. I mean, if Louisville can have one of those this season, that's really what Louisville lacked last year. The guy that had the ball in his hands the most was a guy that knew that there were 0 consequences for him doing anything bad, that he could pretty much just do whatever he wanted on the floor. And no matter what the staff tried to do, there was nothing they could do to change that up, because it was almost like watching just like a bad, county high school team that has a really good player. We've all seen one of those. A guy that's, it could be the quarterback, could be the point guard, could be the center, whatever, a guy that's just more physically gifted that plays that in like the, Kentucky 2A or something, and just dominates against all these quote unquote inferior opponents. Yet their team is like, 5-20 or something like that. That was kind of how Louisville was last year. They basically just had one guy who was the quote unquote alpha, and he knew that he was the guy with the ball in his hands, and it didn't matter how much he turned it over or how many plays he took off on defense, or his role was to just do whatever he could to try to will the team to a win. And that's not going to be successful in high major college basketball.
And whoever the leader is, whether it be JJ, Mike James, Sky Clark, BHH, whomever, they have to talk incessantly, because that was one of my biggest quarrels with last year's teams, and out of the many, is that not only they just didn't talk. They had no verbal communication whatsoever, and none of them really did. Not even, L. Ellis wasn't particularly adept at that, and he was, like you said, he was the alpha, he was the dog, he was the guy who was going to get you a bucket. But they just didn't really talk to each other and communicate. And then you'll see like one of those higher end ACC teams come in, like a Duke and Clemson, for a time when they were on a really hot streak, and they're chatting constantly, like when the ball is moving around. That's Louisville. No matter what this roster was going to look like, no matter who the captain was going to be, no matter all the other variables out the door, they just needed to improve in this one facet, period. Like, I don't care how they do it. I don't care if someone has to break out of their shell, speak, even though they're not very comfortable speaking or being a leader and such. Someone's got to do it.
People are trying to analyze what this college basketball season is going to look like this season. A lot of people are turning to these, way too early top 25s, or, I know some of these guys have a top 40 or a top 100 or whatever. Bart Torvik's rankings are always interesting to look at, just because, he takes a combination of returning minutes, of, what he deems as talent, experience, what the transfer rankings are. He tries to use analytics to figure out exactly how a team projects to play next season. This year looks like Purdue, Kansas, Tennessee, UConn, Creighton, and Duke are his top 6 teams, which is interesting because, that's pretty much falls in line with what most of the pundits would project this season. He has Louisville still as the 3rd worst team in the ACC. And so I guess I was going to ask you, as somebody who kind of follows these analytics, why exactly is that he thinks Louisville is still going to be a bottom feeder?
I think it really just comes down to the coaching aspect has to show people that it can take a step forward. Because, when you look at Bart Torvik's own analytics, sort it by talent, Louisville is currently right now tied for the 3rd most talented team in all of college basketball by Bart Torvik's own analytics. Duke is obviously the most talented by Bart Torvik. Right behind them, oddly enough, is Syracuse. And then Louisville is tied with UNC for the 3rd most talented squad in all of college basketball. Then you think, okay, team's got a lot of talent. They should be projected to have a 20-25 win season, right? Nope. Bart Torvik's projections have them currently going 12-9. Now, granted, schedule's not even out yet, and we only know 4 or 5 of Louisville's non-con opponents right now. So this is a projection, a prediction more than a projection. But they're projecting Louisville to go 12-19 overall and 7-13 in conference play.
Yep.
I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the coaching aspect wasn't that great last year. And we can admit and say, hey, yeah, Kenny is a first-year head coach. And this is the best way that I can explain it to people whenever someone comes up to me and says, hey, why was Louisville so bad? Or Louisville sure did something, blah, blah, yada, yada, yada. The best way I can put it is that Kenny Payne's baseline coaching acumen was a lot lower than I expected it to be. And I think that's a very fair thing to say. That's not me being a hater. That's not me shitting on KP. Just watch the games. You could tell that he was a first-year head coach, but as someone who's been around basketball for his entire life, I was a little bit surprised that his overall feel for the game didn't seem to be all that great. When to call a timeout, when to put out a set play, just communicating simple commands to his team instead of just letting them run around, which I know he wants to have a free flowing offensive system, which, get the right guys in, get the right system in. Yeah, it can be successful, but at some point you got to run plays. And for 2/3 of the year, it seemed like every time they ran a set play, they committed a turnover. Right. It was almost comical how every time there would be a timeout called, and then Louisville would come out of the timeout and run a play, they'd turn it over almost every single time.
Yeah.
Almost every single time. And that was what was, I believe, the biggest disappointment out of everything that happened last season, is that his baseline feel for the game, his baseline coaching acumen wasn't nearly what I thought it was going to be. Now, granted, he's had an entire year to learn how to be a head coach, the ins and outs of the job. He's going to have a whole nother offseason under his belt, one doesn't have the quote unquote cloud hanging over him, one where he's got a more talented roster. So I would hope that his overall coaching ability would take a step forward, because it needs to.
I think that anybody who's ever had to step into a leadership role, the transition is always much more difficult than you think it's going to be. When you go from, kind of being that second guy, he was like the good cop to John Calipari's bad cop at Kentucky. And now he has to be the bad cop a lot of the times, and he doesn't necessarily know how to do that. And for anybody who's listening, who stepped into any sort of leadership role at your company or any sort of leadership role in your life, when you become a parent or whatever it is, it's much more difficult, when you're the person who's quote unquote being led. It seems like, oh, well, I would have done it this way. I would have changed this. I would have done that. But then when you're the person who has to make that decision that impacts other people's lives, it's much more difficult to make that decision. When you have those people's eyes on you, when you have those ears listening, and you have to be the person who has to make the final decision, that's much more difficult than I think people understand. And so when you have to do that, and you have to balance the fact that you control a lot of what the team does in the game. You control when timeouts are called. You control what plays are called. You control what their schedule and what the practice sessions look like. And oftentimes, Kenny was the guy that was taking the orders, and he was kind of, he was kind of doling them out, right? And now he has to be the guy who organizes that and structures that and tries to develop this into a well-oiled machine, right? And that's just not something that translated in 2022-23. Going to the Torvik rankings, I think the thing that stands out to me the most is he only has Louisville winning 5 non-conference games, which is funny because we really don't know who Louisville's playing besides they play Bellarmine. We know that. They play Kentucky. We know that. And they're going to play 2 of
Indiana, UConn, and Texas
in
the Empire
Classic.
Texas.
To me, I mean, I would understand that being 2 losses, and I understand Kentucky being a loss. But if you look at the start of last season, I think if we're looking at this roster, say the schedule started the same way next season, where it's Bellarmine, Wright State, and then Appalachian State. I think Louisville wins those 3 games if they get to do them over last season. And I think that Louisville wins those 3 games with the existing roster now. So when you look at things like that, Louisville also played Maryland at home, which I think would have been a much closer game. A second or with this roster, they beat WKU, they beat Florida A&M. So right there, to me, that's already 5 wins on the schedule. And again, I think that they'll have even more games like that this season. They had Lipscomb, who they lost to last year, who I think that they would dismantle this year personally with the roster that they have. So when you're looking across the roster, I think that there are projections that you see like that you're like, I don't know how much weight that holds, because there could be 6, 7, 8 wins just by changing this roster up, and just looking at the way that the schedule falls. Things just could not have fallen any worse for this team last season. So you come out the gate, almost pulled the Bellarmine one off, lose on a buzzer beater to Wright State, and then think that you had it won on a buzzer beater against App State, only to get it called off afterwards. So, and then obviously you go through a gauntlet of Arkansas, Texas Tech, and Cincinnati, teams who turned out to be pretty solid last season. So it's going to be similar in some aspects this season, but it'll be interesting to see the way that the schedule falls. And obviously when the schedule comes out, we'll talk about that. We'll beat that horse to death. Until that time comes, I think that Louisville probably is going to have 6 or 7 games on the schedule where they should absolutely expect to win and win big. And I think with the talent on this roster and the mindset that a lot of these players have, I think that changes right away. So when you're just looking at the quote unquote bye games in the non-conference, I think right away you already have a few more wins. And then if you're looking to get to that 12 win mark, I think there always is in every conference, there's always the team that gets beat up on. And last year it was Louisville, Georgia Tech, and Florida State. And this year, hopefully Louisville's not one of those teams. And hopefully Louisville has a schedule that's conducive to them getting one of those teams that can beat up on a couple of times. And there you go. All of a sudden you have 12, 13, 14 wins. And then if you can kind of get that ball rolling, it's amazing what just seeing a few more wins up there can do for, momentum for the season. So,
the way that the season started with those 3 really close losses, like who knows what that did to their overall psyche. Now, granted, if Louisville goes 3-0 in those games, I don't think it really changes the season that much. I don't think it's going to make it a winning season. But if they at least go 2 out of 3 in that stretch, the overall product on the floor is probably a little bit better from at least like a momentum, a standpoint like that.
When we look at this roster, I think a lot of people have been talking, and we did too. I think it's just something you have to do this time of year, and especially with turnover like Louisville's had. Uh, we talk about starting lineups, and last time that we met, Jacob and I kind of came up with our very rough starting lineups. Jacob said that he's interested to see who ends up becoming the backup point guard. I think my position battle that I'm really fascinated with is Trey White and Mike James. I think that'll be a good position battle. And who knows, those two guys can end up starting. But to you, if you're looking at this roster right now, who are the guys that you want to see finishing the games? Because I think that's pretty different, right? I think that oftentimes, coaches are more inclined to start their, probably more talented players, but then they might finish, like a Dwayne Sutton or a Ryan McMahon might not start a lot of games, but they're going to finish a lot of games because those are the guys that you trust to be in at the end. To you, are there players that stand out that maybe they might not be starters, but they're going to end up on the floor in crunch time?
I would say probably Trenton Flowers or Caleb Glenn, because my personal starting five, or at least what I expect the starting five to be, is Sky Clark, Trey White, Mike James, JJ Traynor, and Brandon Hutley Hatfield. I think that's going to be the starting five right there, at least. But I could see Trenton squeezing in there somewhere and taking the place that's going to be preoccupied by either Trey White or Mike James. But anyways, I can see a case made there. But I think Flowers has so much raw talent and raw ability that, I mean, you kind of have to put him on the floor towards the end of the game, because we saw what he was doing in the U19 training camp. Now, granted, he didn't make the final cut, but he was still holding his own against a lot of those guys who were equally as talented and capable as he is. And the more experience he gets, the more in-game reps that he gets, he's going to get more comfortable. And I could see Louisville eventually getting to a point where Flowers could be maybe not the guy, but one of the primary late game options.
I don't think there's any player on this Louisville roster right now that has a better 3-and-D game. A guy that has there's nobody that has a more robust game than Trenton Flowers. And so to me, when I look at this roster, I feel like that's a guy that has to be baked into the starting lineup, because he can be someone who can immediately pinpoint mismatches. If you listen to, he's been on a few podcasts. He has kind of done a few interviews where he goes over, he doesn't really talk about what's in his bag, what's in his repertoire. He talks about how he creates mismatches, how he creates for others, what he sees defensively. And so that's when I talk about leadership qualities and what some of these guys can bring to the table. The reason why I think Trenton Flowers can be a one and done is not only because he's a 6'8", 6'9" guy who plays like a guard, but also because he has the mentality of a veteran leader. And I think that's something that Louisville desperately needs on the floor. Not saying that Trey White and Mike James aren't guys that can provide that, but I don't know if they have games that are as conducive to winning as Trenton Flowers does. So I think he's a guy that could be sort of a baked-in starter. The other guy, to me, a lot of people aren't talking a lot about that will contribute right away is Dennis Evans, because of just how good he is on the defensive end. And I know a lot of people are very hesitant about his offensive game and that he's very raw, but Dennis is a guy who he will immediately be the best defensive player on this Louisville roster, in my opinion. And if you listen to a lot of the guys who have had players in the NBA that have coached him, whether it be high school, AAU, whatever else, he's one of the better shot blockers of the last 5 or 6 years. And so it'll be interesting to see if he can have a just okay enough offensive game to where he's not a liability in the middle. And then he could really be something on the defensive end. He can be a guy that even if you get him to jump on a pump fake and a dump off, he can still recover and block a shot, or at least alter a shot. And that's the kind of person that you need down low towards the end of games. If you're playing an ACC team that has a guy that can get downhill and beat one of Louisville's guards or wings off the dribble, that doesn't mean that they're going to score necessarily when you have a guy like a Dennis Evans down low. So to me, those are the two guys that kind of stand out. Is they'll definitely be on the floor towards the end of the games. JJ Traynor is always a guy that I really don't know how to feel about him towards the end of games. I think last year towards the end of the season, his stats were really good, and his impact on that team was really solid. But I'm not sure if that's indicative of his ability to finish games, and that's what concerns me at that position. So I almost wonder if you're going to have like a Dennis Evans or a Manny Okorafor on the floor with Brandon Huntley Hatfield at the same time. We've seen that Brandon has the ability to get out to the floor, and so then you could have Brandon or Manny on the floor at that same time. So that'll be something that's interesting to watch. Switching it up just a little bit, Louisville is finally fielding their TBT team. And
finally.
Yeah, I mean, last year we were all over it, right? Some of the former players trying to put together, assemble, and ultimately field a TBT team, and they pretty much got the feedback of, yeah, we're not putting a Louisville TBT team out there until you can get the big name players. Like they don't want guys. They're not going to advertise a Louisville team if the Louisville team consists of guys who rarely played or have had a career riddled with injuries or something like that, because they want to have the most competitive possible tournament. And they know that Louisville can provide a team that is very capable of winning TBT. So if you're not familiar with TBT at this point, very quickly, it's just $1 million winner-take-all tournament. If you come in second, you don't get anything. Louisville is going to be one of the host teams this year. They're going to be hosting 3 games if they go that far in Freedom Hall. This, I believe, tomorrow. So maybe by the time you're listening, we will already know who Louisville will be playing. And that's going to happen over this summer. To you, Matt, is this a team that you feel is assembled to actually win this whole thing?
Oh, they absolutely can contend and win the whole thing. I mean, I've said for years, and many Louisville fans have said for years, that Russ Smith deserves to be on an NBA roster. And the only reason that he's able to participate in TBT is because they can't be active NBA players. And Russ Smith is probably the closest thing to an active NBA player that TBT as a whole is probably going to see. I mean, he's just coming from overseas. I can't remember what the name of the team he was playing for, but he was over in Italy. And the stats that he was putting up over there in that current season were absurd. I mean, he still can score at will. And then you've got a supporting cast around him of guys that, were pretty good players at Louisville, like a Shane Bohannon, a Chinanu Onuaku, Kyle Keurig, Peyton Siva, his backcourt mate. So, I mean, it's a great collection of talent, but it's a well-balanced collection of talent. I think they can make a really deep run.
If you are unfamiliar with the TBT tournament, so whether you're a player or a coach, you get some sort of share in the overall earnings. Louisville currently has 17 between rostered players and coaches. Who do you think is going to get the biggest share if Louisville wins the whole thing?
Oh, Russ Smith, absolutely.
Think it's going to be Russ?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no question.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's the big name there. It'll be interesting to see, Mark Lieberman, Keith Otto, Mike Stone. Luke Hancock is one of the GMs, and his name is listed as Patrick
Hancock. Yeah, I'm just looking at it, and it just
on the website. They also have Terrence Commodore and Ronnie Taylor as coaches, and then Jordan Suture is another one of the GMs. So all of these guys are going to have some sort of share, which is pretty interesting to me. If you're familiar with local Louisville media at this point, or remember Louisville basketball history, Mark Lieberman was a former Louisville assistant coach under Rick Pitino. So you think Russ Smith is going to get the biggest share? You think Peyton Siva is number 2?
I think it would either be Siva or maybe Keurig, just because Keurig's still actively playing overseas and still, has a really consistent jump shot.
So if each person, and this is kind of sad, but if each person split it equally, they'd end up with $58,823 before tax. So that would be something fascinating to watch. Now Keurig is not even listed on this Louisville TBT roster, so they might actually have 18 people total between rostered players, coaches, and GMs. And unless I'm missing something, it looks like
I don't see him either. But I know he's on the roster.
But Louisville players that people are going to be extremely familiar with: Chinanu Onuaku, Shane Bohannon, Peyton Siva, Russ Smith, and Wayne Blackshear. And if I'm looking at this roster, I think those might be your starting. That might be your starting five. Rakeem Buckles is another guy that's on this team, and then Louisville has some outsiders in Omar Pruitt and Nick Mayo, and also Chris Dow from Bellarmine, who are also involved. But yeah, I mean, I think that Siva and Smith are baked in starters. I think just based on the way that the roster is assembled, I think it's got to be Chinanu Onuaku, and then maybe Rakeem Buckles or Shane Bohannon as the backup five. In this kind of tournament, I don't know if you're not posting up bigs a whole lot in this kind of tournament. So Chinanu is going to be dependent on more as a defensive presence. Dylan Avar and Keith Otto are also kind of part of this team. So Dylan, I'm not sure how much of a role he'll have on this Louisville team. Although I will say, if people remember, he transferred from Louisville to Eastern Kentucky and was pretty successful at Eastern. So could be a guy that backs up Seaver or Smith as well. So when you're looking at this roster, do you think that Russ Smith is a guy that can just like put the team on his back? Like, I think this is a guy. I think Russ is built for the TBT. Like, I think he's the type of dude that might just like put up 40 randomly in a TBT game.
I mean, considering he was taking over teams while playing actually professionally, I can see him just taking over a game, no problem in the TBT. Now, granted, I say this having zero knowledge about who else is playing in TBT and what other teams are going to be playing. So maybe there's another team out there who's just laden with talent as well.
Yeah,
but I mean, it seems like Louisville is going to be destined to make a deep run in the TBT, at least at a minimum.
It's fascinating to me to look at, and there's that word again, fascinating, to just look at the roster and see that Kyle Keurig isn't listed, because I wonder if they might roll without him. I don't know if maybe there's something going on where he's not going to be able to get back over and practice with the team enough. I'm not sure, but yeah, Keurig seems like a guy who'd be a starter on this team. Shane Bohannon hasn't played a ton of high-level pro ball, so he's and really neither has Wayne Blackshear hasn't had a successful career like a Russ Smith, a Peyton Siva, or a Kyle Keurig as far as his success in other leagues. Now Omar Pruitt and then Chris Dow have, so that'll be interesting to watch. I think that Louisville has a really solid 6 or 7 man rotation here, but obviously I think a lot of what's selling these tickets is Peyton and Russ. I think
no question.
And then maybe, secondarily, Shane Bohannon. So I think if you could have assembled a roster full of former Louisville players, I think that all the guys that you would have included that would be eligible for this tournament are included. So that'll be a fun one for sure. Now I'm always interested to see how they kind of brand this. So it says that they'll will make their TBT debut in the summer of 2023, hosting their own regional in historic Freedom Hall. This team will consist of some of the Cardinals' greatest, including Peyton Siva and Kyle Keurig. So again, they're branding Siva and Keurig as the two guys instead of Russ Smith. So that's interesting.
Well, they put that description out there before they announced Russ, so that's why.
I'm still wondering. Again, I have no knowledge behind the scenes, but I'm wondering if Keurig will be a part of this team after they've added 3 or 4 guys from outside of Louisville's former rosters. So looking ahead, we will soon be finding out what Louisville's schedule will look like in 2023-24. Once that happens, I think that'll kind of open up a whole nother can of worms. Exactly how this schedule plays out can dictate, what the success of this team is like. If they have kind of a front-loaded schedule, you could be looking at another season again where, you have an inexperienced team and experienced coaches, and you're in for another long haul. However, I think the type of players that they have on this roster ultimately are going to lend towards more success on the court, whether that means 8 wins, 10 wins, 15 wins. I'm not sure. Before we get out of here, last question for you, Matt. If you had to set the bar for what Louisville has to achieve, number 1, to get Kenny Payne off the hot seat, but number 2, to kind of make you feel more comfortable about the direction of this program, Is it making the NCAA tournament, or do you have a kind of a win number in mind?
I'm not going to go with a win number, but I mean, you have to make the NCAA tournament. You have to. With the amount of talent that is on this roster, I mean, like it should. I don't want to say it's going to be easy to make the tournament because it's never easy to like have a deep postseason run or anything. But the way that college basketball is now, you can orchestrate a quick turnaround really easily. I mean, we saw a lot of first-year head coaches do it last year. I mean, Jerome Tang's the first one that comes to mind. Matt McMahon at LSU had things going for a little while, and then they kind of sputtered towards the second half of the season. But I mean, it's Kenny Payne's second year. He has a roster that is vastly more talented than the first one that he had. I see no excuse that they should miss the tournament. And there's some of his friends like Dale Griffith said earlier this offseason that there are no excuses. And so I'm going to say it. If they do not make the NCAA tournament with this team, regardless of what their schedule actually looks like, it's a failure. Point blank period. Because all this chatter about, he needs like a 3 or 4 year rebuild. I mean, pardon my French, but that's bullshit. In this current era of college basketball, any like coaches who are good at their job can orchestrate a turnaround in 1 year. Now, granted, the circumstances are a little different for Kenny Payne considering the mess that he was inherited, but considering how they were able to turn things around in the course of this offseason in terms of player acquisition to set themselves up for the 23-24 season, I'll say it again. I don't think there's an excuse to miss out on the tournament.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you there, Matt, just in the sense of I think the narrative of this being a multi-year rebuild went out the window once Louisville got its IRP ruling back and they were basically cleared of having any sort of consequences.
Yeah, I mean, if they had gotten significant penalties, then absolutely it would be a multi-year rebuild. Right. But I mean, we can say it. Louisville got a slap on the wrist. I mean, you can say, yeah, the penalty is in the way, which, yes, I agree with that to a fault. But I mean, given what was on the table or potentially on the table for Louisville, they got a slap on the wrist.
The staff was preparing last season to have multiple scholarship reductions.
Yeah.
To the point of, it looked like they probably brought in Hersey Miller to be a walk-on. And then they're like, oh, well, I mean, we still got like 2 or 3 scholarships left. So here, you can have a scholarship for a season. So I think that the bar has to be set at making the NCAA tournament this year. I don't think that Kenny Payne's gone if they don't, but I think that there's going to be a lot of skepticism around this program if Louisville doesn't make the tournament with a roster like this. I think that Trenton Flowers is a guy that's a one and done type of player. I think that Sky Clark is a guy that'll be in the league before his eligibility expires. I think that Dennis Evans is a guy that is budding with potential. You got a Tyler Johnson again on this roster that could be a serious contributor right away. There's so much talent on this roster. I think that it's up to the coaching staff to kind of put it together. But the last thing I'll say too is last year's team really lacked dogs. Like they were guys like taking plays off was the norm last season. Attitude problems were the norm last season. A losing mentality was the norm across the roster. This year, that doesn't feel like the case. There's a reason that a JJ Tranter, a Brandon Huntley Hatfield, a Mike James came back. And that was because they had the correct mentality. And I think you add a Sky Clark, who is absolutely a leader and a dog, add a Trey White, Trey White was a very scrappy player at USC, a guy who his contributions did not show up oftentimes on the stat sheet. And then you have guys like a Trenton Flowers coming in where, again, I think that he's an absolute dog. I think he's a guy that he's going to warrant a ton of playing time next season. So this is a roster that's filled with stud athletes, and now it's just up to the staff and to the players to kind of make it assimilate into something that's legitimate. Matt, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We'll let you get back to talking football for the coming weeks because there is a lot of exciting stuff on the horizon, not only in football but in all Louisville sports. Matt, tell the people where they can find you.
You can find me on Twitter at Matt McGavic. That's my personal. You can find my site's Twitter profile at U of L Report. You can go to my website directly at si.com/college/Louisville. I am usually posting content on a daily basis, if not multiple times a day, even in the off season, because, content still has to be produced, man.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. As always, Starting 502 podcast, Starting 502, that's Starting 5, FIVE, number 0, number 2 on Twitter and all social media platforms, at the State of Lou, and of course at Press Meyer, one of the best accounts that you can follow on Twitter. Until next time, Starting 502 podcast, go Cards. Let's get out of here. And then we'll find where you stop the recording. Where is the stop the recording button? I don't see it.